Hi, I've created a couple of slideshows to help everyone use physical literacy to create quality movement experiences. Part one talks about the background related to all of this so that you can be equipped with the latest knowledge and different tools to design quality movement experiences for children in school, at school, and in the community. Movement at schools is really what we're talking about. So I'd be remiss if I didn't talk to you about all the different types of opportunities that you can move in and at school. Certainly, a lot of people talk nowadays about active transport, children using their bikes, running, walking, scootering to school. And certainly that is part of mobility enhancement that we can think about in the community and in and around school to allow children to move using their own engine. But it also includes about the school, in the playground, in the front of the school, etc., but also in the hallways in the school. The physical education, of course, is a critical part of movement at schools, and it's curricularly linked and trying to develop the competence and confidence of children to not just participate in school, but in their community and for their life. Recess is another time period in which children can be active if they choose to use active play. At school leisure programs, of course, are fairly common in Sweden, less so in Canada. At school sport programs are very common in Canada and less common in Sweden. And then certainly most schools will have special field trips or functions like going out to go ice fishing where I live, and everybody would be involved in the movements that are required to do those activities. But what's really important is that if you're working in school settings, you really have to think about authentic linkages to the community, because ultimately when children leave school or graduate from school, their movement opportunities are then restricted to the community setting. So nowadays, and physical literacy demands that we link what is happening in schools with what's happening in communities, and both schools and communities should have movement opportunities for all people so everybody can see themselves moving. The background that we need to start with is what I call the physical literacy revolution. The physical literacy consensus statements that have emerged around the world from different countries and different organizations is quite informative, because even though physical literacy probably originated in the late 1800s, its modern evolution is very interesting. So I'm going to take you through a series of slides giving you how there's been a revolution or evolution of the concept to be much more inclusive in thinking related to people moving in society. One of the original definitions of physical literacy was created by the Aspen Institute in the United States of America. And one of their tasks was to just define physical literacy for parents, for the average adult. And they came up with this definition, which I particularly like. I don't hate this one. It says that physical literacy is the ability, the movement ability, the confidence, and the desire or motivation to be physically active for life. And I would say, in a nutshell, that is a pretty good definition back in 2015. At the same time as the Americans, Canadians created Canada's Physical Literacy Consensus Statement. You can download this. It's a 2-page document. Of course, we wrote it in both French and English. And we went with not only a definition, but a whole couple of pages that describe the concept as well. So I encourage you to download Canada's Consensus Statement. It's a pretty good one, because it talks more than just a definition. But I'll read out this definition for you. Canada adopted the International Physical Literacy Association definition, which is really the definition that Dr. Margaret Whitehead had created in the early 2000s. And she said physical literacy is the motivation, the confidence, much like the Americans said, the physical competence and knowledge and understanding to value and take responsibility for being active for life. So do I like that definition? Absolutely. However, I do have problems with that definition in the sense that it doesn't really tell you where to start and how to get there. So I'm going to take you to another couple of definitions and some of the most recent ones, and you'll see how from the early days in physical literacy consensus statements to now, we've got some much better conceptualizations of this concept. Sport Australia gave us this definition, which was really just a paraphrase, a juxtaposition of the words, but it did bring some interesting notions to the concept of physical literacy in 2019, where they said physical literacy is about building the movement skills, the knowledge related to movement and the behaviors associated with the movement. And all of that will give us the confidence and motivation to lead active lives. Ireland, all Ireland, created a wonderful physical literacy consensus statement back in 2022, and they presented that at the International Physical Literacy Conference in New York, and it received quite a lot of attention. And one of the things that I thought they did particularly well in our evolution of this physical literacy concept was that they tied three things that I think are really important. And if you're a practitioner in this field, I take this slide quite seriously. Although it's quite simple, it conveys a lot. It says that if you combine thinking of movement with doing movement and feelings with movement, we know from a neuroscience point of view that that creates and persists in memories in yourself much better than if you just think about movement, if you just do movement and you don't feel movement. So by combining thinking, feeling, and doing, we get the maximum change in the brain, and that brain change would include the motivation to and ability to participate in movement for life. So I really think this notion of think, feel, do is quite simple, but an important one if you're a practitioner. Last October, the Physical Literacy Consensus Statement for England came out, and another step in the evolution of the concept. And although Margaret Whitehead, resident in England, was one of the early mavens of this concept in the year 2001, we didn't see the consensus statement for England to come out till recently. And I like this because it's one of my favorites now, because of the fact that they started really thinking about what were the intrinsic reasons that people move, not just thinking about a mindset of creating competence and confidence, but saying it's much more than that. And so they created this graphic, and you can download this from their website. They said physical literacy is our relationship with movement and physical activity throughout life. So it starts from very early age, 0, and goes all the way up to death. But the important thing here is that they really identified quite graphically that people need a positive and meaningful association with movement. And I'm going to talk a lot about that today. What is that relationship? Enjoyment, value, meaning? And we'll really use those terms later on because that really jives with some of the research findings as well. They also talked about how we move, connect, think, and feel during movement and physical activity is critical in helping people move. So it's not just about telling people to move because they need to, otherwise they'll get disease. It's a very physical activity mindset. Physical literacy talks about the intrinsic reasons, and there are many. And the last one, and very importantly, they talk about physical literacy through life, and I'll add to that, through life and for all abilities, all cultures, all people. And they really talk about the fact that your ability to move through life changes, and there's many factors, and you can read there that are both social factors, cultural factors, and environmental factors. It is as important to get people moving, but it's equally important to create the right social context for movement and the right environmental context. So I encourage you to have a peek at the English consensus statement. Well, a year before the pandemic, both the World Health Organization and Canada created 2 documents about increasing physical activity of the world, for the World Health Organization and for Canada, through the Let's Get Moving document. You can download these and have a peek. But it was really important that major government agencies now, in recent years, have really adopted the concept of physical literacy and believe that it's an essential part and the foundation, perhaps, of becoming active for life. Here is an extract of the World Health Organization document. This is the Objective 1, Action 1, and it says that for member states, every country in the world, we should develop a national communication strategy related to increasing physical activity. But I want you to read the bottom part. And it says not only to talk about the benefits of physical activity, not only to advocate for having people move more, but it says very clearly that we now need to add to that the notion of increasing health literacy and physical literacy as part of that equation. That is the first time that the World Health Organization has done such a thing, and I think it's critical and vital for you to understand that the WHO is behind you in using physical literacy as a means by which to increase movement in society. This is an extract of the Let's Get Moving document, and this is our Public Health Agency of Canada's document on the importance of trying to establish means by which to increase the physical activity of the entire population, independent of your age or ability. And this document, which you can download quite easily, has a common vision, and that common vision is founded on this notion. The physical activity for all is based on 5 parameters, but you'll notice that the first of the 5 parameters is physical literacy. So I ask you to consider this because my government says physical literacy is the foundation for physical activity for all. And I think that is something that I aspire to, trying to say, how do we actually implement that in different parts of society, across schools, communities, workplaces, at home. And so for me, I'm very happy to see that most governments have adopted physical literacy as a concept, and that they're really thinking it might be the missing link for creating a physically active society. This research paper, called Physical Literacy, Physical Activity and Health, is quite a popular paper, and my friend John Kearney, now in Australia, we sat down with our crew of folks writing this paper, and we created, a rather crude PowerPoint diagram, which you can see here. This is a public access paper that you can look at, but what you'll see on the left-hand side of this diagram is the physical literacy engine or cycle or process. I like to call it an engine. But what you'll see is that it is the precursor, the antecedent, the thing that you need to get physically active. That's how it's positioned in this diagram, because we know without any doubt that if you're physically active, you get better physical health, mental health, and social health. So this is how we position physical literacy in this paper, to say it can be a definition, and they're rather interesting definitions, but maybe the most important way to enact physical literacy is to understand physical literacy as a process, as a cycle. So we made this diagram in here. I'm going to show you this diagram in more detail as we go through this talk today. One of the things that I wanted you to see before we really go into the detail of physical literacy as an engine is to think about how physical literacy people think differently than physical activity thinkers. If you're a physical literacy person, you don't think about quantifying how many minutes of physical activity that you do. The guidelines, 60 minutes a day for a child. That's always in our minds, but our goal isn't that. Our goal is to have children and adults actively participate in society through movement. That's the goal. So we use the phrase active participation or social participation, whether that's in sport, recreation, performing arts, activities of daily living or vocation, or just playing games or playing. So the goal of physical literacy, unlike physical activity, is active participation. And of course, if you actively participate, you'll probably get your physical activity. That's the trick. We also want adequate safety, not surplus safety. During the pandemic, many countries went into a surplus safety mindset, safe as possible, as opposed to safe as necessary for the development of movement in society. So we call that adequate safety. Now, of course, for any individual person like me, that means I can meaningfully participate if I'm physically literate in my world through movement. And as a result of movement, I don't just survive, I thrive. And finally, if everybody in society becomes physically literate and they actively participate meaningfully in society, we'll get greater health equity, greater social equity, and human potential will be developed for all, independent of your age or your ability. This is a newer slide for me, and I created this one because I really wanted to bring across the point that if you're working in school settings due to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, you'd really understand that developing the child's potential is our goal. And the Convention is quite clear that we want to, through the school system and through our communities, develop a child's fullest potential, not just physically, but mentally, psychologically, and socially. So in physical literacy, we take it pretty seriously that we're not just talking about physical competence development, like basic movement skills. That is part of the equation. But when you move in society, you can develop social competencies, the ability to negotiate with each other, etc. You can develop psychological competencies like regulating your behavior while you're working with other people, and you can develop problem solving and decision making capacities or creative capacities. So in physical literacy, we talk about developing the potential of people, but when we're talking about the potential, it's not just physical like fitness or strength, it's social competencies, psychological competencies, and creative competencies through movement. So we call this the 4 domains of competency. And the 4 domains of physical literacy competencies are not just the physical as we talked about before. So it's inappropriate to think about physical literacy simply as foundational movement skills like hopping, jumping, running. Those are part of the equation, but they're not everything. The ability to avoid collisions or walk on ice are also physical competencies, and those are important ones. But it's also the components like social ability, the ability to interact with others, negotiate, work with each other, regulate yourself in front of others, the psychological competencies like confidence, and creative competencies, the ability to problem solve and innovate, etc. So when we talk about competencies from here in, I will be talking about these 4 domains and how they're interlinked. So if you're a practitioner in a field, you should be thinking about not only am I designing programs for children to move so they develop their physical abilities, but it's also their creative abilities, their social abilities, and their psychological abilities simultaneously. Often when we start thinking about helping children, we think about lesson plans or coaching sessions, and that's good. Those are programs. But the other part that's equally important is the places that people move. Well, land, air, ice, snow, water, moving with other people, different ages, different cultures. But it also involves the people, the training of the people like pedagogues, and how do movement pedagogues get trained to help people move in different contexts, different social contexts, different environmental contexts. This little diagram here helps you realize that it's the person-context interaction that is critical, that as pedagogues we create. We create environments for people and programs in those environments through the training that we have, our pedagogy, and deliver those things. So this interaction between these contexts is really critical to consider. So it's not just thinking about a single lesson plan, it's about that environment, socially, culturally, and physically. And also realizing very simple things like many things we do in school aren't outside. They only involve land-based movement. So many curriculums, many schools offer opportunities to move in the outdoors, and that's increasingly very important as we want to value environments. So this is a reminder that to think broader than just the programs you deliver, but think about the places and environments that you create, and think about those interplay between them. This slide helps me to start to move towards thinking about how to design things. So I know it's a bit complicated, but it does have many things we've talked about already. What you see in this slide on the left-hand side is movement context. That could be in a classroom or at recess or out at a lake. So those are different movement contexts. And those contexts can be sport-based, as it lists, performing arts-based like dance or circus. It could be daily living tasks like shoveling snow, or working in a job, lifting objects and carrying them about. So in those movement contexts, we like to pose to you the notion of constructing positive challenges. And construction of positive challenges is really a way to think about how do I design the environment, like we talked about on the last slide, how do I create the programs, and how do I train the people to deliver those programs and design the environments so that people can achieve a quality movement experience. And hopefully, with every quality movement experience, you'll have a positive movement experience by activating the physical literacy engine. If that's what you do, if you're able to construct positive challenges to create positive movement experiences, then the participants will get improved physical abilities, improved psychological abilities, improved social abilities, and improved creative abilities through activation of physical literacy. Now, I'm going to point out something. We, in the programming world, we as pedagogues are often trying to do prescriptive movement. That's where we tell people what to do. We don't involve them in the decision-making or the problem-solving process because we're very prescriptive, as we say. But what's interesting here is that if you add creative componentry to your lesson plans, to your coaching sessions, to your activities, people engage more because they feel ownership in what they're doing, because you're saying it's your problem to solve. It is your decision making that counts here. And that means a person gets a sense of ownership in the movement. That's the creative angle. And so think about all four of these domains of physical literacy and using them to your advantage to help people get motivated to move for the right reasons. So now we get down to business. What this diagram shows you is the basic core physical literacy engine, which is consistent with every definition of physical literacy. What you see here is the four domains of competencies on the left-hand side: physical, psychological, social, and creative. And you see an arrow going to confidence. What that tells us is that as a practitioner, as a pedagogue, you really need to think about coupling intentionally confidence to competence. But now it gets a little more complicated because you need to develop the confidence of a person for movement, physical capacities, the confidence of the person for social negotiation while you're playing a game, the confidence in their own creative capacities, and the confidence in your own psychological abilities, belief in oneself. So when we're talking about competence and confidence, we like to couple those together in physical literacy because we know from self-determination theory that if you're competent and confident, you feel both of those things, you're motivated to continue participating. So you can see I've got a traffic light there because it is then possible to think about activating the engine, the ability to turn that engine on. And that's really important because most pedagogues that I talk to, coaches, teachers, parents, they really accept the fact that we should develop physical capacities of kids and have good social skills in kids. But they forget about the fact that you should intentionally think about confidence at the same time as competence. Because people that aren't confident and yet they might be competent don't perform well. But if you are confident and competent, you perform better, data shows that, and you're motivated to participate. So this engine is a critical part of thinking and activating physical literacy through the lesson plans that you do, the environments that you create. This is a little slide that I like to show people right after the one we just went through. And all I've done in this slide is said some obvious things. One, when you're a pedagogue, you got to think about confidence by design, intentionally, not just by chance. You can't just hope people get confident. You have to create the circumstances to allow them to become confident. And we'll talk more about that in our second half. But you'll also notice that I put arrows both ways now, that there is an arrow going from competencies to confidence and confidence to competence. They interact. There is lots of data to suggest that you want both of those things working for you. But sadly, when I'm in many settings, in movement settings, in coaching, in sport, in teaching, I often see not just no intentional confidence building, but I often see confidence erosion behaviors. People using words, people having body language, people creating lesson plans that will actually erode the confidence of children or adults. So I often say that the first step in moving forward in creating competence and confidence is to get rid of your own erosive behaviors as a pedagogue. You have to step back for a second and think, am I doing something here that's actually not building confidence, which is actually eroding, which is the opposite of what we want? And once you get rid of your eroding behaviors, then we say it's time to build. What are the best practices? What are the best ways to speak to somebody? What are the best ways to move with people? How do you set up drills or activities that make people build their own confidence? And make sure you don't steal it from kids, because it's easy to say, hey, I'm a great teacher. Your abilities came from me. Well, that's called stealing confidence, and that's a confidence eroding behavior. So I want you to really think about your practices as being either confidence building or confidence eroding, and really get on the side of confidence building. This is from a study. I know it's a little complicated slide, but it's easy to talk through. So if you're working with a kid in a certain movement context where they're participating, could be at recess, could be in a classroom, could be outside. So that's the movement context at the top. When you're working with those kids, and let's just say if you activate the physical literacy cycle, illustrated here in green, a positive movement experience, they might leave that session with, yay, that was great, a positive movement experience, because you constructed a positive challenge for every kid in that activity. They came out with a positive movement experience because they became competent, confident, happy movers. Well, that's a great thing. The other side is that we have a notion of what's called negative movement experiences, that people can sadly leave different contexts, sport, recreation, physical education. Sometimes they can leave with a negative movement experience. So science has told us that people accumulate these. And what the bottom part of this graph means is that if a kid comes to school, they might have an active transport to school. They could play outside for a few minutes before school starts, get into school, moving in the hallway, have a phys ed class, have some recess, have a leisure pedagogy, have a daily activity session, what have you. Well, if you think about that, that's a bunch of different experiences which you'd hope throughout the day. There might be 10 movement experiences for a child at school each day. You'd want to see most of them being green, most of them activating, most of them causing positive movement experience, because we, as adults, have crafted quality movement experiences intentionally. We know from science that if you accumulate more positive movement experiences, people, children, will then associate happiness with physical activity rather than unhappiness. And sadly, in most societies, Canadian and Swedish, females, due to the fact that we don't construct quality movement experiences well for females, mostly for males, the average female in Canada associates unhappiness with movement rather than happiness because they've accumulated more negative movement experiences. It's critical to think about having all children leave with green positive activations. So this brings me to emotions. And emotions are part of the physical literacy equation. Think, feel, do. Remember that? Feelings are emotions. And we've got lots of them. We've got negative ones, we've got positive ones, and emotions are really, really critical. If you scared the living daylights out of somebody, they remember things quite easily. But if you also reward them well with confidence building, that can reinforce memories in a positive way. So I'm going to talk a little bit about emotions now. So as you guys know, we can activate this physical literacy cycle and turning it green, but I also want to talk to you today more about the fact that you can actually deactivate the cycle and turn it off, turning it red. So most people think about activating the cycle, making competent, confident movers that are motivated to move for life. And that's green activation of the physical literacy engine. But it's equally as possible to actually not activate it, or worse, deactivate it or turn it red through negative movement experiences. So here in this slide, we can think about activating the physical literacy engine where we get competence, confidence coupling, and then we are motivated to move. And the emotions that I've shown in this diagram for the green activation are things like pride. When you feel competent and confident, you feel pride in yourself. When you learn something new or get distracted from life, you feel enjoyment or fun. And if you get connected to others through movement or connected to a new instrument, like here's a golf disc, I get connected to devices or connected to my hockey skates. These three things, connection, enjoyment, and pride, are critical positive emotions that are associated with activating the physical literacy engine through the competence, confidence, motivation pathways. So what we're looking for when people leave experiences is some combination of connection, enjoyment, and pride. There are other positive emotions, but those are the critical ones. On the flip side is deactivating the engine. And deactivation of the engine, stopping it from happening, or even worse, making it something that's a negative memory, is usually associated with three negative emotions. One is shame. I feel bad about what I do. Somebody made me move in front of somebody else and I didn't want to do it. I get social inhibition. Sadly, about 40 to 50% of kids will feel socially inhibited, meaning they don't feel comfortable moving in front of others because of the negative movement experience they had somewhere with a parent, a teacher, a pedagogue of some nature. So when you get a negative movement experience, you want to avoid things like shame. This is not good. That's the opposite of pride. We want to avoid boredom, because if you're bored, you're not engaged. And we definitely don't want to get angry about something. And you can get worse emotions than this, but in typical settings, these three emotions, anger, shame, and boredom, are the three that we really want to avoid in our physical literacy contexts where we're creating quality movement experiences. So you have a job of constructing positive challenges for everybody in the class so that people can get pride, enjoyment, and connection through activation of the physical literacy cycle, and we avoid or minimize the number of situations where people feel shame, anger, or boredom. I'm really happy to say there's some good science around talking about emotions now, and not just one emotion like shame or one emotion like pride, but multiple emotions. This is a master's thesis that was just completed last fall, and it really talked about how quality movement experiences, when you craft them using constructed challenges, when you use quality movement experience thinking using the physical literacy engine, when teachers or pedagogues use those circumstances, this study shows that 98% of students can leave with a positive movement experience, which is an amazing possibility, isn't it? So the other thing that this study showed us is that quality movement experiences can be achieved by good programming, good training of people, and creation of good environments or places, so people, programs, and places. And this study also showed that the emotional experiences that people have are strongly tied to their physical literacy, how much they value movement, and their own self-esteem. These are all really good things. I don't want to spend too much time diving down in the research components of this, but what I did want to do for you is talk to you through some research data. Now this is a pretty simple diagram, and it actually, each slice, it's called the bread slice, each slice is a child, and these happen to be 10 years old. And so there's 145 children across 145 slices. And you'll see that there's some emotions on the left-hand side of this graph: pride, enjoyment, relief, how you feel after, shame, anger, and boredom. And I'm going to tell you that when these kids came out of 5 different schools from 5 different movement experiences, all of these kids were exposed to quality movement experiences using physical literacy, where the teacher constructed positive challenges for all kids. And this is what happened. So this is the future. What you can see is that the first kid felt just pride and enjoyment, the first slice. And at the bottom it says AEE, which is the overall emotional experience. So the higher it is green, the more positive they were. If it was red, it was negative. But what I want you to see here is that, first off, we've sorted these kids. And most of the kids, all the way, a lot of them, about 70% of them, only experienced positive emotions, pride and enjoyment. Yay, that is great. So that's possible. So they would have had a positive movement experience for sure. And you can see on the bottom line, lots of green happening there. Now, this was really interesting to us and really important for this audience to hear. You'll notice there's a bunch of yellow here. It's called mixed emotions. And the mixed emotions meant that the children experienced both positive emotions like pride and enjoyment, but they had some combination of shame, anger, or boredom. Not all kids had shame, not all kids had anger, not all kids had boredom, but what was really important, which nobody knew prior to this, is that if you look at the yellow kids, about 27% of the kids who had mixed emotions, if you look at the bottom, their overall emotional experience was still positive. So if you have negative emotions, but you also have them concurrently with positive emotions through your 30-minute class or whatever it is, your 30-minute coaching session, we know that children can still leave with a quality movement experience. And in this data set, you'll notice that there was only 1, 2, 3, 4 children that had net negative movement experiences out of 145, which is amazing. This is what we want in every movement experience possible. If you're a pedagogue in any fashion doing movement pedagogy, this is the goal. And now I'm showing to you that it is achievable, and it is through physical literacy thinking to do so. One of the key philosophies underneath achieving activation of the physical literacy engine, the competence, confidence, motivation engine part, is a notion that we must accept, is that people that come to us in a physical education class, in a movement session, in a leisure pedagogy session, in a dance class, they come to us with different levels of ability. And many times, beginning teachers often think about designing a lesson plan or drills or activities or exercises that cater to only 1/3 of the audience, which means they only engage 1/3 of the students, which means 2/3 leave with negative movement experiences. So a principal rule of physical literacy is that there is a level of challenge to every level of ability. If you're going to deliver something, that's your obligation to figure out how do you get a level of challenge to every level of ability. Luckily enough, we have a theory, which is a scientific theory. It's called optimal challenge theory. Some people call it the zone of proximal development. And basically, it's a simple thing that says that if it's too hard, I'm out. I'll get frustrated. That's not good. Or even perhaps angry. If it's too easy, I'll get bored. Both of those are negative emotions and cause deactivation of the physical literacy engine. If you have a level of challenge suited to my level of ability, I get engaged. And if you design it well, I can get more competence and simultaneously see that I'm getting better, so I get more confident, and then I'm motivated to continue and get better. So optimal challenge theory says you must need a level of challenge for every level of ability. So again, this is just a simpler diagram saying the same thing, that if you teach to the top of the class, you get 33% of the students. If you teach to the bottom of the class, you'll engage 33% of students. If you teach to the middle, you get 33% of the students. So optimal challenge theory says we don't want that. We actually want a situation where you can engage all the participants. So once again, what that means, and I want you to have this drilled into your head, is that there's a level of challenge for all levels of ability. If you don't do that, you're going to have people wallflowering and disengaging. And interestingly enough, if they're in a school setting, they can be physically present but mentally disengaged. This can happen. This is not good. So even though they are forced to be there because of the school day, they can actually check out because the level of challenge is not appropriate to them. So here's a kind of like an important notion that if you develop competence and confidence simultaneously through constructing positive challenges where a child can be engaged and get into the process, they might have a little negative emotion to start going, ooh, I don't know. But if you do it just right, they'll get involved in that process and they'll overcome the negative with a big positive, walk away, woohoo, pride and enjoyment, and then they'll leave with a greater belief in their own ability. That's called inner trust. That's self-confidence. So we want children to leave with an increased belief in themselves. And that means that the emotion that's tied to that is pride. I feel good about what I'm capable of doing, not being told what to do, but what I'm capable of doing. And that develops inner trust. And I have on the last part of this slide, over on the right hand, a little fingerprint, face fingerprint, which means that, and this is a really critical notion for you to think about, you want people leaving your movement sessions with an increased belief in their movement identity. We want people to have a movement identity. It doesn't mean team sport. It could be dance. It doesn't mean activities of daily living like shoveling. It could mean a recreational activity like climbing a mountain. So, but through school, we want all children to develop a movement identity. That's our goal. And not all kids need to play hockey. All kids should find a movement identity and have one. Maybe an identity that has multiple movements underneath of it. So this is an extension of that idea. We want belonging in society. Swedish people believe in that. We don't want conformity, fitting in. We want belonging. And what that means is that when people are moving, they can connect. And they can connect while they're moving with others. And connection or relatedness is a basic human need. Everybody needs it. Later on, we're going to talk about the different types of connections that are possible. But right now, I want you to think about the movement identity concept. And what you can see is that Fostering a movement identity means helping a child find their movement voice. What is it that, let's help them find it in school, let's help them get better at it, let's help them express it, and then let's everybody accept them for how they like to move and what they like to move like. That's belonging through movement. And so putting the you in movement. And this is critical because often we think about having people fit into a certain type of activity, like a specific sport. Everybody should do this. Well, that's not true. Everybody should find their movement voice, or better yet, movement voices. We have data that shows that children that have multiple movement voices, meaning different interests and likes in movement, survive better during the pandemic because they could self-organize their own behavior. I'll talk more about that in part 2 of this presentation. So it's worthwhile just to reiterate again, maybe you can think in the most simplistic way that maybe the job of movement at school is not to create physically active, sweaty messes. That's an interesting physical activity notion, but maybe it is helping kids find their movement voice. If you're there to help them, along with physical education, leisure pedagogues, and others, help them find the voices that they like through positive movement experiences, that's a wonderful thing. But if they have a negative one, they might not like something for a long time. They remember that, right? I had a bad experience in team sport. It wasn't good for me. I'm not doing team sport ever again. Well, they still could have a movement identity doing an individual sport, yay, and working with teammates, but they might avoid team sport for life. So our job is to help create as many positive movement experiences and a diverse set so every child can find their movement voice, develop it, use it, and be accepted. 2 slides left. So this slide is a busy one, but it's really a summary. So what I want you to do is take a peek at this slide, because this is the current physical literacy engine published in 2023. And if you take a peek at this, it's really reiterating everything we just talked about. Over on the competency side, we see the 4 domains of competence: the psychological domain, the creative domain, the social domain, and physical domain. And we see that positive coupling can occur between competence and competence, and you should intentionally plan for that. If you don't do that, children will get self-doubt and uncertainty, emotional experiences that are negative. We don't want that. So, but we do know that if you develop competence and confidence in the right way, people will develop, if you move over along the right-hand side, pride. That's the emotion with feeling good about your own ability, a belief in oneself. And we know that if you feel pride and self-confidence, you'll be motivated to continue to move. You'll also do this thing called valuation. You'll say, hey, this is a good thing. I like this. You can also have negative valuations. So what we want people to do is leave with positive movement experiences by developing pride and self-confidence so that they value the movement context, like sport, like recreation, like performing arts, and they're motivated to continue doing it. The thing we don't want to do is create shame. Shame along that pathway will actually deactivate and then cause negative valuation for a long time of a certain movement context. So you may have a kid coming to your soccer session, your football session, but because of a previous experience that they had where they are shamed and they had their confidence uncoupled from their competence, they have self-doubt, they will walk into your session, even if it's going to be a good one, with a negative valuation, which means that it'll be really hard to convince them that it's going to be better again. So think about that when kids come to you. Even though you might be a great pedagogue, they might be coming to you from pedagogues that created negative movement experiences, creating negative valuations of what you do. So realize that they exist. The bottom part of this graph is also as important. See the one in purple? It talks about having fun and pleasure. And fun and pleasure is learning something new. Fun is distraction from life. If you have fun or pleasure at the end of your movement session, you'll remember it as enjoyable. And we know, without doubt, if something's felt as enjoyable, you're motivated to continue. And if you see it as enjoyable, you'll positively value it. The green line is really important. People can be connected to movement. And earlier on, I picked up this thing here. This is a disc. And if you, like, I've got 3 of them here. Here are 3 different types of discs used in disc golf. And if you look at these 3 discs, I can tell you disc golfers will be connected to their discs in, pretty serious ways. Their discs are important to them. They don't want to use other people's discs. It's their disc. And people can be connected to other things. Like I have dogs, so my dogs and I are connected to their collars. That's a connection. I have some new runners here. I'm connected to these. I haven't tried them yet, but I'm connected to them. They're interesting. They're cool. So I want you to look at this connection piece, because the connections can be through self. I can be connected to self. Oh, I love to move. I haven't moved a lot. To other people, to places. Oh, this is a cool place to do things. Always wanted to swim here. Oh, that was cool. And places can include sights, that which you see, and even sounds. Music can be a connection. To objects, like I did, the discs, runners, skates, lacrosse sticks, bandy, blah, blah, blah. But it can also be groups. Like if you're in a Zumba group, hey, I'm part of a group. If you're in a paddle club, that's your group. Or other living things. Other living things like dogs, trees, plants, etc. When I'm designing lesson plans, I'm always thinking about each kid will have a different form of connection, and each type of connection is important, but not all kids will have the same connection. But I'm thinking about that when I'm constructing my positive challenge. What are all the types of connections I'm making? Because we know if you create connectedness, you're going to create relatedness, which is a basic human need. If you have relatedness, it drives motivation and valuation once again. And finally, the last arm on here, the little blue one, a little brown one, is the agency creativity arm. And that just means instead of being just prescriptive in what you do as a pedagogue, you really got to provide people with problem solving and decision making. That is the foundation of creativity. Not just telling them how to do it, but letting them explore how they might do it, maybe even engaging in how it's really important for you to do it, and this is the way I do it. But if they don't ever do that, they're going to look for you to tell them what to do when they're in trouble, and you won't be there. So that is where agency comes in, and this is a really big, important term. We do know that children that get the physical literacy cycle activated, and there's many ways of activating that cycle, become agents. They can self-organize their own behavior, and they can organize with other kids to do the things that they want to do, as opposed to wait for a parent or need structured activity. This is the physical literacy engine, and the parts in red are negative emotions, the other parts are positives, and through construction of positive challenges designed to create movement experiences, positive movement experience for all, we can achieve some wonderful things. So this is the last slide, which I'll start the next talk with as well. So I'm not going to go too deep into it, but what I want you to see here is this is the same diagram that I just showed you, but in a more linear way. If our goal is to create active participants in society through children, in school, around school, in community, at home, wherever you are, our job is to create agents that are self-competent, that have relatedness, and have enjoyment. So when we're trying to drive positive valuations about movement and drive motivation to become active participants, I always think about my lesson plans, my coaching sessions, using these frameworks. It doesn't mean every single time I do it, but I think about this list and I go, okay, what am I doing to create ownership in movement? What am I doing for decision making? How do I let children make decisions? How do I let them problem solve on their own so they can have that when I'm not around? That's agency. I always think about competence and confidence coupling. That's essential to do. Confidence can't be a secondary thought. It has to be confidence building, not confidence eroding, and it must be coupled. Then kids believe in themselves, inner trust. Relatedness, connections to people, places, objects, groups, and other living things are critical to think about. Some people will be connected to objects, some people connected to groups. Talk about that with children. What is the connection that you value? And then finally, of course, we want things to be enjoyable, but when kids are really learning something new, they typically don't have a smile on their face. It's like this is hard, but then they learn something new, that's pleasure. Children tell us it's pleasurable to learn something new, but they don't have a smile. So don't just think about counting smiles. But fun is important too. Fun and pleasure are the foundations of an enjoyable experience. So I want to leave you with this for part one as the foundation for drilling down into how to do this into real movement settings.